The debt ships don't forget the Kaelen Compact had a rule older than its written laws. Never rescue a species before it earns the right to be rescued. Wisdom, they called it. Mercy delayed is mercy that means something, the elders said, because a gift given too early teaches a young species that suffering has no cost. So when the Compact's long-range sensors found a small, wet blue world spinning quietly at the edge of a spiral arm nobody bothered to name, they did what they always did. They watched. They took notes. They waited to see what the vermin would become before deciding whether it was worth becoming anything at all. For 400 years, they watched humanity claw its way into orbit, then out past its own moon, then slowly, stubbornly out into the dark between the stars. The Compact's analysts filed reports, aggressive but fractured, resourceful but wasteful, emotional to the point of self-sabotage. Interesting, one report noted, but not yet a candidate for contact. The vermin, as the older Compact officers still called them in private, needed more time to prove they deserved a seat anywhere near the galaxy's table. Then, in the year humanity called 2087, a piece of the sky came loose. It wasn't a war. It wasn't an invasion. It was simpler and crueler than either. A rogue gravitational anomaly, the kind the Compact catalogued and mostly ignored because they occurred once in 10,000 years, and rarely intersected anything that mattered, drifted through the outer edge of the solar system humanity called home. It didn't strike the Earth. It didn't need to. It brushed against the orbit of a moon-sized ice body in the system's Kuiper belt, and in doing so it nudged 300 kilometers of rock and frozen water onto a new, quiet, patient trajectory. Straight toward Earth, 11 years out, then 9, then 6. The Compact knew. Of course they knew. Their sensors had mapped that anomaly a century before humanity had built its first working telescope. They watched the trajectory solidify, watched the numbers converge on inevitability, and they did nothing, because doing something meant admitting a species not yet judged worthy of contact was worth saving. The Compact had lost entire outposts adhering to that rule. They were not going to break it for a species that still fought wars over borders drawn by dead men. Humanity found the object on its own. A woman working a graveyard shift at a survey observatory in Chile noticed a smear of light that shouldn't have been there, cross-referenced it against nothing because nothing existed yet to reference it against, and spent 4 sleepless nights confirming what her instruments were telling her before she dared to report it. She was 31 years old. She had taken the job because it paid better than teaching and let her sleep during the day, which suited a woman who had never much liked mornings. She did not become famous for the discovery. Her name appeared in exactly one footnote of exactly one preliminary paper before the international response absorbed the findings so completely that nobody thought to ask who had found it first. She never complained about that. Years later, when a journalist finally tracked her down and asked how it felt to have gone unrecognized for spotting the thing that nearly ended the world, she reportedly shrugged and said that the point had never been her name. The point had been the 6 years, and the 6 years had been spent. By the time the number 6 years became public knowledge, half the planet already knew because half the planet had learned, the hard way over centuries, not to trust its governments to share bad news quickly. There were riots in a handful of cities, the kind the Compact's analysts had fully expected, and had in fact budgeted for in their projections as evidence of the species' fundamental instability. What the analysts had not expected was how quickly the riots burned themselves out, not because they were suppressed, but because the people in them ran out of appetite for chaos once it became clear that chaos wouldn't buy them a single extra day. Within a month, most of the anger had curdled into something the Compact had no clean word for in any of its languages. A grim, communal, teeth-gritted determination that looked, from orbit, almost indistinguishable from calm. What humanity did next was the thing the Compact's analysts would spend the following decade arguing about in closed sessions. They didn't panic, not for long. They didn't turn on each other, not in any way that mattered. Every nation that had ever built a rocket put its rockets on the table. Every nation that hadn't started building them anyway, in 6 years from nothing, because the alternative was watching their coastlines and their children disappear under 300 kilometers of rock and ice. Scientists who had spent careers as rivals started sharing data before they'd finished writing the emails asking for it. A military that had spent a generation building weapons to point at other humans spent 18 months retooling its entire industrial base to build something that had never existed before. A fleet of interceptor vehicles designed to survive a single, one-way mission into deep space. Factories that had built cars the year before built fuel tanks instead. A shipyard on a northern coastline that had spent 3 decades laying down container vessels laid down something else entirely. A hull nobody in that yard had trained for, using welding tolerances nobody in that yard had ever been asked to meet, and met them anyway because the alternative was explaining to their own children why they hadn't tried. University students who should have been finishing degrees in unrelated fields found themselves pulled into the effort because the effort needed hands and minds faster than it needed diplomas, and nobody had time left to insist on doing things the old way. A generation of engineers who had spent their careers being told a project like this would take 15 years, and a budget no government would approve got both the budget and the deadline at once, and simply quietly, found out that 15 years had mostly been an estimate built on the assumption that nobody would ever need to move faster. The Compact watched all of this with the detached interest of a species that had seen 1,000 civilizations rise, and 1,000 more fail to rise in time. Their internal wagers, and yes there were wagers, placed humanity's odds of stopping the object at somewhere between 2 and 11%. Their most generous models still had the planet losing most of its coastal population and a measurable fraction of its topsoil. Their least generous models had it losing everything east of a line that didn't exist yet because no human cartographer had needed to draw it. 11 months before impact, the Compact's Oversight Committee convened. As they always did before an extinction event on a world they'd been observing, to formally note the outcome for the historical record. It was procedure. Nobody expected the meeting to take longer than an afternoon. It took 4 days because a junior analyst named Vesk, barely out of training and not yet cynical enough to know better, stood up in front of 11 senior officers and asked a question nobody had asked in 300 years of compact history. What if we're wrong about what a species has to prove? Vesk had spent the better part of a year buried in raw data nobody else had bothered to read closely, because raw data from an unjudged species was, by policy, low priority. Vesk had read it anyway in the hours between assigned duties, in a habit that senior officers found faintly embarrassing in someone so young. Vesk had watched in painstaking detail an engineer in a place called Ohio redesign a reactor shielding system 3 times in 11 days after each version failed, sleeping 4 hours a night, refusing every offer to hand the project to someone less exhausted, because she had run the numbers and she was, quote, the fastest person alive at fixing her own mistakes. Vesk had watched a coalition of 31 nations that didn't trust each other on anything else agree, unanimously and within 6 hours, to share a launch window that benefited the nation that needed it most and cost everyone else nothing but pride. Vesk had watched a retired grandmother in a farming town donate every coin of a pension she'd spent 40 years saving to a crowd-funded satellite tracking initiative, on camera, telling a reporter she didn't need to see the stars saved, she just needed to know she'd tried. Vesk had watched over and over a species that fought itself constantly and viciously over almost everything choose, the moment the stakes became absolute, to stop fighting and start building. None of it on its own would have moved the Oversight Committee. The Compact had watched other species rally in a crisis before, briefly, before collapsing back into the same fractures that had always defined them the moment the pressure eased. What made Vesk pause, and what eventually made the committee pause too, was a smaller pattern buried inside the larger one. Humanity's cooperation wasn't fragile. It didn't require the threat to stay at maximum intensity to hold. 6 months into the crisis, with the deadline still years away and the immediate panic long since faded into routine, the collaboration hadn't loosened. If anything, it had tightened, become procedural, become habit, the way a muscle a species didn't know it had suddenly discovers it can flex on command. That, Vesk argued, was the detail 400 years of prior observation had never once recorded in any other candidate species, not the crisis response. The fact that the crisis response outlasted the crisis. The senior officers were not moved by sentiment. The Compact did not run on sentiment, but Vesk had come prepared with something the Compact did respect, a projection. If humanity survived this on its own with no outside intervention, the resulting civilization would emerge from the crucible harder, faster, and more cohesive than 400 years of Compact observation had predicted was possible for a species at their stage. And if the Compact intervened now quietly, without ever making contact, without ever letting humanity know it had been helped, they would lose nothing of the data and gain potentially an ally instead of a grave. It wasn't mercy that won the argument, it was math, but Vesk didn't much care which one did the work. The Compact's intervention when it came was small, almost insultingly small by the standards of what they could have done. They did not send a fleet. They did not reveal themselves. They did not so much as brush the edge of the incoming object with a tractor beam, because that would have solved the problem too easily, and easy solutions taught nothing. Instead, 3 months before humanity's own hastily built interceptor fleet was scheduled to launch, an anonymous data packet appeared in the inboxes of 17 separate research institutions across 9 countries. No sender, no signature, no demand. Just a set of equations describing a more efficient reaction mass configuration for a kinetic deflection charge, the kind of detail that would have taken human engineers another 8 months to derive on their own, months they didn't have. Nobody who received the packet could trace where it came from. Most assumed a rival lab had leaked it. A few quietly assumed something stranger and said nothing, because there wasn't time to chase ghosts with the clock running the way it was running. The fleet launched on schedule, 11 vessels built by hands that had never built anything like them before, crewed by volunteers who had signed contracts guaranteeing, in writing, that they were not expected to survive. More than 200,000 people had applied for 11 crew slots that only needed 66 names filled, a ratio that the Compact's demographic models insisted should have been statistically impossible for a species this young, this fractured, this supposedly self-interested. The final 66 were not chosen for heroism. They were chosen the way engineers choose anything, for competence under pressure, for steady hands, for for the ability to keep working when a checklist item failed and there was no time to feel afraid about it. Several of them left recorded messages for families they did not expect to see again, and by unspoken agreement across every country involved, none of those messages were made public until after the mission concluded, one way or another. It was, Vesk would later note in an internal memo nobody outside the committee ever read, the single most human decision the Compact observed during the entire crisis. The choice to protect the privacy of the dying before anyone knew for certain who among them would die. The Compact watched from a distance no human instrument could detect, and for the first time in 300 years of institutional patience, more than one member of the Oversight Committee found themselves, against policy, against precedent, quietly hopping. The interception happened 11 days before the object would have reached Earth's orbit. 6 of the 11 vessels made it to the intercept point. 4 of the 6 charges detonated as designed. It was enough. Not clean, not painless, the object fractured instead of vaporizing, and the 2 largest fragments still crossed close enough to Earth's orbit to light up half the planet's sky with a meteor storm that killed 11 people in 3 different countries and would be remembered grimly as the worst night in human history that wasn't actually the end of the world. But the world did not end. The coastlines held. The children whose disappearance had been modeled into every Compact projection grew up instead, went to school instead, in a world their parents had bought them 6 impossible years to save. The 5 vessels that didn't make it to the intercept point never came home. Their crews had known going in that this was the likeliest outcome. They went anyway. The Compact's data on that fact alone, the willingness of ordinary, mortal, unaugmented humans to fly into the dark on a one-way ticket for people they would never meet, became one of the most heavily cited internal documents in Compact archives for the next century. Vesk, 3 years later, no longer junior, no longer quite so easy to overlook in committee meetings, was the one who finally proposed what the Oversight Board had been circling for years without saying out loud. First contact. Not conquest, not observation, not another 4 centuries of watching from a polite, cowardly distance. An actual introduction. An admission if humanity asked the right questions that they had been watched the whole time and helped once quietly when it mattered. The vote wasn't unanimous. It rarely was. But it passed, and 8 years after a piece of the sky had nearly ended everything, a Compact vessel took up a stable, visible orbit around a small, wet, blue world and opened a channel. The message the Compact sent wasn't a warning, and it wasn't a demand. It was at its core remarkably simple, the kind of thing a species that valued good arithmetic over grand speeches would think to say. We have been watching you for 400 years. We watched you almost lose everything, and then we watched you refuse to lose it. 11 years ago we gave you a small piece of the answer you needed, one you would have found yourselves eventually. We simply saved you months you did not have. We are telling you this now because a species that fights that hard for people it will never meet has earned the truth, whether or not it has earned anything else. Humanity's response when it finally came 3 days later, after governments that still did not entirely trust each other managed to agree on a single unified reply, was not what the Compact's analysts had modeled. There was no outrage at having been watched in secret. There was no demand for further gifts, no negotiation for technology, no posturing about strength. The message, translated eventually into every Compact tongue that mattered, read simply, "Thank you for the 11 days you gave us. We spent them well. We'd like to know you now if you're willing to be known." Vesk, watching the reply come in from a small office on a Compact station orbiting a star humans had not yet named, found something in that answer that 400 years of careful, patient, unemotional observation had never quite managed to predict. Not gratitude alone, though there was plenty of that, something closer to recognition. A species that had spent its entire violent, fractured, stubborn history fighting itself over nearly everything had somehow, in its worst possible moment, remembered how to say thank you before it remembered how to ask for more. The Compact had a rule older than its written laws. Never rescue a species before it earns the right to be rescued. What nobody had thought to write down in 300 years of careful policy was what happens after. What a civilization owes the people who quietly bought it 11 days it never knew it was given. Humanity, it turned out, without ever being taught the rule existed, had already worked out the answer on its own. You don't repay a debt like that with gratitude alone. You repay it by becoming the kind of civilization that, 400 years from now, finds some other small, wet, frightened world running out of time, and decides, without a vote, without a wager, without 3 centuries of hesitation, first to help. The stars had been patient with humanity for 400 years, waiting to see what it would become. Humanity, it turned out, had been quietly practicing the entire time for the moment it would finally get to return the favor. End.